Hello, everybody. Very happy to present this paper, joint paper with Jean Tirole from the Toulouse School of Economics at the I3h seminar. So as usual, I will try and talk for 45 minutes. Clarification questions are, of course, welcome. And then we can have a further discussion afterwards. And we stop at the latest at 2 p.m. So this is an applied economic theory paper. So I will try and give you a flavor of the model and the results and the intuition, and then focus on applications that are relevant to health, and in particular, the opioid crisis and the scandals concerning the retirement homes in France, but I think it goes beyond France. Now, this paper is about whether the market weaken our moral compass. It is a big question. If you look at the debates in the media and so on, you have in particular a line in public opinion, but also with politicians, religious leaders, even the Pope, philosophers, warning against the religion of the marketplace. And the one thing we will try and do in this paper is define which characteristics of the market are problematic and which are not. And I think in our simple model, you will see, I hope, you will be convinced that we deliver a number of interesting insights that we think enrich the debate. Now, this idea, as I say, in the public at large about problems generated by the market has been confirmed in experimental work. There is recent experimental evidence on the so-called replacement excuse. If I don't do it, someone else will. And that suggests that the market involving a number of competitors, both on the supply side and on the demand side, that indeed there may be something going wrong here about indeed the market weakening or moral compass. You have quite a number of examples where you see this happening. Immoral actions that create or boost demand for profitable products, selling weapons to people who shouldn't buy them, overselling financial products that in fact are against the interest of those who buy them but are naive. In the health sector, opioids, you've heard about pill mills that are specializing in giving these addictive painkillers to people who shouldn't use them. You have athletes taking illicit drugs. You have at times bribing in order to sell products. So there are lots of things that are happening, not always only in a market setting, but market, in particular competition, can indeed, in some cases, intuitively, it seems that it can make the problem worse. And so this is the kind of idea that a number of immoral practices for some businesses are just a mere cost of doing business. If you get caught, you pay the fine, and that's part of indeed the cost of doing business. Or your reputation may suffer a little bit, but after a while, it's okay. So the question that we are asking here is which kind of features of market competition are responsible for this? Oops. Yeah, so sorry about that. I have to master the technology. So basically here, as I say, we are talking about the intensity of competition and the extent to which it will be a problem. But you know, while you can measure competition in terms of the number of firms competing, the substitutability between products, the potential for collusion by oligopolistic firms. But what we show in the paper, in our simple model, is that the description of competition goes beyond this simple market structure, and it covers the overall ecosystem. And in particular, first, whether prices are flexible or fixed. And indeed, in the health sector, often prices are fixed. Second, what do people care about? Will cutting ethical corners lower the costs or boost demand, or whether it will be the opposite? I mean, clearly, if you can get away with pollution rather than implementing costly anti-pollution mechanisms, then indeed you can make more money by polluting more. If you can, without people knowing, use labor by children who may cost less, that is indeed a positive advantage. On the other hand, at times, you really don't want getting caught by being unethical, and you may want to look ethical because your investors are ready to give you better terms, because your workers prefer to work for ethical companies. There is evidence that in particular, for example, workers are ready to work for NGOs at lower wages than they would work for big banks or big consulting firms. Consumers may want to buy ethical products. So in that sense, it can also be profitable to look and hopefully be ethical if one can appropriately measure how ethical you are. Then, for your behavior, the behavior of rivals may be very important. What if your rivals do have strong social preferences? What if your rivals are not-for-profits? So the question then is, do less ethical suppliers drive out of the market ethical ones or not? And when should we expect non-profits to behave like for-profits because of potential competition by the latter ones? So these are questions we will try and look at. So what I will do here so there is a paper that you can access from the invitation. And so what I will do is describe the essentials of the model discussed in the paper that allows to think about the impact of market structure and the overall ecosystem on ethical choices. I will give you a little bit of technicalities, but I will stress also the big punchline, and then I will draw conclusions for the US opioid epidemic and the French retirement home scandal. Okay, so, and bear with me, there won't be many slides with notation, and I will go step by step. But I think it's important to give you also a feeling of what's in the model before I make some claims about what it delivers. Okay, so we are looking at N competing suppliers, and we will vary N, serving unit demand consumers, so consumers that decide to buy or not a unit of the good. And suppliers, and so supplier I in particular, but from 1 to N, will choose two things: a price, which we call PI for supplier I, and a moral action, AI for firm I. And the idea is that the higher the AI, the more ethical you are. And this will be the total impact you have on social welfare, societal welfare, will be the welfare you create for the consumer and society times the number of consumers you will have. So that's a simplification, that it will be linear in your volume sold. And so we summarize the choice of morality as a point AI on an interval, and the impact you have on society we will call big W, so welfare, which will depend on your choice of AI. And the idea is that the higher the AI, the higher that social welfare, so W prime positive, the derivative. And on the other hand, there are decreasing returns to make sure things are well behaved. So the second derivative is negative. Now, that's the impact of your moral choice on social welfare. And then there is the cost for you. And as I said, the cost for you, which we call CI of AI for firm I, is either increasing in this ethical intensity, like, if children are less expensive, if you can use fossil fuels that are at the time cheaper. So that is bad for your profits. On the other hand, being more ethical can also be good for your profits, in the sense that if you're seen as more ethical, investors are ready to lend to you or to buy shares at a lower price. Workers can be ready to work for you. Input suppliers in general can be willing to work for you at a lower wage. And so it will depend on the type of problem we are looking at. So we've talked about investors, workers, now consumers. Well, consumers will, in the model, have a demand that depends on what we call the net price that you are offering. And we call the net price PI star for firm I as the price that you are going to pay, PI, plus a function phi I, which will be increasing or decreasing in the morality of the action. Okay, so basically, we will distinguish between socially responsible consumers and irresponsible consumers. Now, responsible consumers, that's indeed, for example, those who like to prefer, who like to buy cleaner products or products that don't are not made using child labor. That's so for those, the net price is above the regular price, the higher the ethics you have. So they are ready to pay more for ethical products. So phi is positive. Instead, irresponsible consumers, I will come back to that. Irresponsible consumers, they are ready to pay more if you are less ethical. And as I say, this will involve a number of things. But so that means that, as I say, with irresponsible consumer, the higher your ethics, the less you can sell. Now, let me give you some examples. Well, I mentioned responsible consumers, that's easy. If you are a fair trade producer, you attract consumers. Consumers will instead boycott unethical firms, fossil fuel companies and the like. That's so demand increases if you are more ethical. Irresponsible consumers, that is the case too in other situations. For example, some people, some sports people want to find suppliers that will give them illegal performance enhancing drugs. or they want fake medical certificates. So if you are less ethical, you get more of these customers. Dictators want to buy weapons, even though they may have very bad ideas. So if you lower your ethical standards, you get these customers. So that's the externality. As I say at the bottom, in this case, these are people who know what they are doing, and they benefit, given their preferences, they benefit from facing a firm that is ready to sell to them. The other two cases are maybe more interesting in the opioid and the retirement home cases. These are consumers who are willing to go to ethical suppliers, even though in the end they will be hurt by them. Now, the first case, the opioid case, basically, you are addicted. As we know, opioids are very strong painkillers that are very useful in some cases, like terminal cancer and the like. On the other hand, being addictive, they are dangerous. And for example, it's a bad idea to use them against back pain. But once you are in that vicious circle, you really want them for immediate gratification, even though it hurts you in the long run. So there is a conflict between your current self and future self. So you don't know what your interests are. And so here being irresponsible means being hurt by this behavior. But indeed, in front of you, there may be an unethical hospital, for example, a pill mill that is quite happy to sell you this stuff and make money on it. And there, being less ethical for that hospital will mean getting more money. And then there is the case of shrouded or hidden attributes. The fact that the consumer may be naive, may not understand that the financial product your bank is selling you is toxic, may not understand that the food you are eating has too much fat or sugar. Seniors may not understand that they are mistreated, they may not remember. So basically there, it's exploitation of naivety by consumers that, if you do it in a ruthless way, can indeed raise your demand. So as an owner of a retirement home, you advertise that it's a little paradise with a lot of nice green gardens and so on. And in the back, you're not treating them well. These are things that can clearly happen. So it's very different. So for the responsible consumer case, you make more money by being more, you improve your demand by being ethical. In the case of irresponsible consumers, you lose money by being ethical. And as I say, from the point of view of customers, there is really win-win in the case of externality, while in the case of internality or hidden attributes, the customer is really the victim. So I have now described the model. So basically, what we then do is compute the equilibrium of this market. Each firm will choose a price and a level of ethics, so a P and an A, PI, AI for firm I. So the vector of net prices goes from P1 to Pn, and moral choice is A1 to AN. And so basically, as I say, P star, because this is the net price, that is the price, P plus the moral component. Okay, so then the demand will depend on the price negatively, because indeed, if it's more expensive, you demand less. and on the prices of the other suppliers. And since they are substitute, the higher the price of the net price of the other suppliers, the more your demand is higher. So basically, we come with a simple objective function. So each supplier will try and maximize the V, so VI for supplier I, which is the profit, price minus cost time demand. And indeed, what counts for your profit is the price you receive, but the demand depends on the net price, which is price plus phi of A. And then you also care as a supplier, because you can also be ethical. You care about the impact of your choice, PI star and well, P star, PI and AI. You care about the impact of your strategy on the total welfare of society. And so alpha I is the intensity of the social preference of the firm, so this will be the rate at which you compare your impact on society with the impact on your profit, and we will assume that this societal welfare is the welfare that each of them, each supplier is creating, depending on its AI, times the number of customers they have, plus the sum of, for each other supplier, each competitor, the impact they have given their AJ, J different from I, times their number of suppliers. And so the bottom line is a simple trade-off between profit and impact on society, with alpha I, which gives you the importance of the social concern relative to profit. Now, then what you do in this simple equilibrium setting. In fact, the question we will ask is, what if intense competition becomes more intense because there are more firms and goes up, or there is more substitutability, the elasticity of demand, which I haven't written, but basically the elasticity of demand is how many customers do I lose, which percentage of my customers do I lose by changing my price, by increasing my net price by 1%. And so all this is, there are proofs in the paper and so on, but trust me, or if you don't trust me, go and read the paper, please. So basically, as I say, VI is this sum, which I already wrote on the previous slide, of profits plus alpha I times societal welfare. And then what you do, you can basically replace PI by P star I minus phi I, which is so the price is the net price plus phi I, given that the net price was PI. The price is the net price minus phi, because the price was the net price plus phi. Minus cost. And then what we've done is just replace the big W by what I wrote before. And so the equilibrium condition, when you try and optimize over the net price and the level of ethics, is that in fact the level of ethics is determined independently of the net price. So interestingly, the intensity of competition doesn't seem to enter the optimality condition. I will come back to that. I think it's the most important result of the paper. It's simply saying that you will want to choose a level of ethics that will balance the net cost of you, net marginal cost for you of being more ethical in terms of the production cost, C, and your impact on demand, phi, and you will equate that, so the impact on profit, with the impacts on your societal concern. So your parameter alpha I times the impact of AI on the total societal welfare. So what we then know, and I think that's the last slide with Greek letters, you can then, if you want to think about the various sources of social concerns, let us replace the impact on cost as an impact on operating cost, which we call gamma I, and we add then to that the social concerns of workers, big W, and investor, big I. So basically, when you are more ethical, you will possibly have increased operating costs. For example, if you use cheaper technology, which is unfortunately dirty. On the other hand, you will attract workers at a cheaper wage, investor at a cheaper return, as long as they care about that, and the intensity of worker and investor concerns are alpha W and alpha big I. Finally, for the impact on demand, so that's linked to consumers. So we will assume that the psi I is what you may gain by being less ethical on irresponsible consumers. So that the more consumers are irresponsible, the biggest the derivative of psi. But on the other hand, you will lose on, by being less ethical, you will lose on responsible consumers. And so basically, if you put in the formula above, at the top of the slide, the new definition of Ci prime and phi I prime, you end up with this nice equilibrium condition. I find it nice. You'll tell me whether you agree with me, which is basically saying that the equilibrium level of ethics will depend on the left-hand side, how much you can gain on in terms of operating costs and in terms of basically attracting higher demand from irresponsible consumers versus the sum of the ethical concerns of first your own, alpha little I, then workers, then investors, then responsible consumers. So the key thing is that, as I said already, demand has disappeared from that equation. So competition intensity does not impact the level of ethics in the market. So if you believe in competition, strong competition, because that lowers the price and therefore consumers can buy at a level of production which is closer to marginal cost, which typically economists like. Economists are typically in favor of competition policy. Well, here it says that at least in this model, you shouldn't change your preferences on that, because the intensity of competition will not crowd out the ethics. At least, and I should have said that more. Basically, you can drop the little I if you think that all the alpha I's and all the technologies are the same. So if you have symmetric competition, which is the implicit, so with symmetrically endowed firms in terms of technology and social concerns, well, the competition intensity will not change the ethics, in contrast to what we talked about in terms of the replacement excuse. And so before focusing on that and giving intuition for that, what the formula shows, and this is intuitive, is that the level of ethics, so A, will rise if everything else equal, alpha Lidl is higher, so the supplier is more ethical, understandable. If workers care more about ethics, then you gain more in terms of wage cuts if you are more ethical. If investors are more ethical, so they, sustainable finance and so on, if this becomes more important, you will want to respond to that. And if consumers are more ethical, so they are more responsible, alpha C higher, and it is more difficult to, if the gain of being unethical in terms of operation costs reduction is lower, so if green technologies are not too expensive relative to so-called brown technologies, and finally, if consumers are less irresponsible, so either less cynical in the case of externality, or less addicted, and so less naive, and better informed about the true quality. But as I say, all this is intuitive, but I think the fact that we have this additive structure, very simple, I think is interesting. The surprising result is the relevance of the intensity of competition. So moral choices are independent of the demand function if prices are flexible. The intuition is that there are two effects here. If all of a sudden demand is more elastic because the number of competitors is higher, or the elasticity of demand substitutability is higher, then indeed by changing A, your market share can change more. So it looks like from that point of view, the profit motive becomes more important relative to the social concern. But on the other hand, with flexible prices, when you have more elasticity of demand or more funds in the market, the stakes of a change in market share, so the amount of money you're making on every additional customer is lower. So there is a reduced markup effect. And in this model, the two effects compensate completely. So what remains is that the equilibrium ethics will depend on how ethical are the suppliers, the consumers, and the stakeholders in general. This is, interestingly, in contrast with the model by Duffenberg and others, including Georg Kirchsteiger, which was published in 2011 in the Review of Economic Studies, where it is social preferences that become irrelevant in the case of strong competition, and the competitive pressure that crowds out the societal preferences. Now, we discussed the exact reasons for why we have this opposite result, but I guess this is beyond the scope of this presentation, but it's in the paper. Now, we have this result saying that with flexible prices and symmetric competition, so symmetric suppliers, you have an irrelevance result. The intensity of competition doesn't make a difference. Now, we then look at two reasons why this result could be invalidated. The first is fixed prices. As I said, in the case of a number of markets, prices can be regulated. Then there will not be a reduced markup effect of intense competition. And then, indeed, the only effect of higher elasticities is that the market share effect is the only one. And with irresponsible consumers, more competition will impede moral behavior. So it vindicates the idea, if I don't do it, someone else will. Because if you can get more customers at the same price, if indeed the demand is more sensitive, you will in fact take advantage of that. And there, indeed, competition is bad for ethics, Instead, with responsible consumers, interestingly, there is the opposite. Consumers having more choices, you can indeed, by being more ethical, being seen as socially responsible, then you can have a bigger market share. So you can expect there that, for example, in the case of consumers disliking dirty technologies or or disliking unfair trade, child labor and all that, competition will in fact be good. So basically, until now, I guess the jury suggests that the intensity of competition is in fact not on average bad, it's also not on average good. It will depend on the structure of the market. If consumers are irresponsible and prices are fixed, then competition will be bad for ethics. If instead consumers are responsible and prices are fixed, competition will be good for for ethics. And with flexible prices, competition is irrelevant. Now, the last result is the one which is most damning for competition. It is when we have suppliers with different ethics, so different alpha I's, and possibly different corporate forms. Until now, suppliers were for profit, even though they had a social conscience, higher with a higher alpha, lower with a lower alpha. But what if they are not for profits? And not for profits, by assumption here, is you just price equal to cost. Then what we do see is that in fact, the more competition there is, the more we will move towards a lower price cost margin. But in fact, it will prevent, in order to survive, not-for-profits from behaving ethically. And there, basically, the more competition there is, the more we will converge towards the ethical choice decided by the lowest ethics supplier, alpha, the lowest alpha I, and we will call the lowest alpha I just by notation alpha 1. So basically, in the limit, everybody is converging towards a level of ethics defined as before, except that for everybody, rather than alpha I, it is alpha 1, defined as the minimum of all alpha I's that will. So basically, we have a race to the bottom in terms of ethics of the supplier, but you see that otherwise, the effect of the supplier, of the worker social concern, alpha W, the investor social concern, alpha I, and the consumer, responsible consumer social concern, alpha C, are still there, just like the impact on technology and on irresponsible consumer demand. So if these alpha W, alpha big I, alpha C are big enough, and if alpha 1, despite being the minimum, is sufficiently high, then you still have possibly an acceptable level of ethics in the market. But so the implication of all this, and now I've given you all the punchlines, is A, competition policy is not the problem per se, but if there is a problem, it has to do with the heterogeneity of supplier concerns, ethical concerns of suppliers. And there, what we show is that indeed not-for-profits, if competition from for-profits is strong enough, they are unable to behave differently from for-profits. So if you want them to behave like not-for-profits, you need to protect them from the competition of for-profits. And more generally, you may want to make sure that these alpha I's by suppliers are high enough so that the suppliers are not so obsessed by profit that their alpha goes to 0. So what does this mean about our applications? The opioid crisis, which has been called the biggest drug crisis in US history, and started with legal substances. Now that one tries to control the illegal substances, illegal ones like illegal fentanyl and the like have a reason, of course. So the devil is out of the box. But let's focus on the legal part. Why did we have the problem according to the model? Well, if you, not according to the model, but how are the questions translated into the model? First, clearly, as I say, it was a case of irresponsible patients being hooked on opioids so that their short-term urge is inconsistent with their long-term well-being. So that's the first problem. They can be taken advantage of. The second problem is that you often have regulated prices that remain high. And keep in mind that the higher the price, the lower the ethics with irresponsible consumers, because it's more profitable to take advantage of them for a given elasticity of demand. Finally, next to these two problems, this is a case where you have some ruthless suppliers. By now, the scandal of Purdue Pharma and OxyContin, with their very aggressive marketing tactics, sales incentives for representatives, free drug samples even, as we discussed with Michel in a letter to the New England Journal of Medicine. Basically, some for-profit hospitals behaving like pill mills, some distributors being also very aggressive. All this has ended up in court, but as I say, the devil is a bit out of the box, and so the crisis is not over. But so clearly, this fits a model where alpha 1 is very low, and where basically you can make a fair amount of money abusing irresponsible consumers. What should you do in this world? Well, next to more controls on the companies by regulator, you should avoid excessive prices, because excessive prices make this behavior more attractive, more profitable, and reduce the intensity of profit seeking by basically changing the corporate charter of the company. I'll come back to that later also, but reducing the importance of the profit motive is the thing to do. For retirement homes, recent scandals in France, this book by Castanet, which has been validated later on by public reports, public inquiry. There, in terms of the model, you have irresponsible residents, just like in opioids. They are abused, they are victims. This is not the case of externality. They are just ill-informed. They are abused by these hidden or shrouded attributes. These are senior citizens that are fragile and have a hard time evaluating quality, and their family doesn't always have the time to go and check. So basically, these are fragile customers. The second problem, again, intense competition for fixed welfare state subsidies. And finally, ruthless for-profit suppliers that go for profit at the expense of residents' health and welfare. And there was also this program, Cash Investigation, where it showed that the book was about Orpea, but this program on France 2 was about Corian and Domus V. And frankly, it's basically the same. Recommendation from the model, next to more controls, avoid excessive fees. And I think that's an interesting point. Everybody's saying, but part of the problem is because the government doesn't subsidize enough these companies for treating better their patients. Well, it turns out that the more generous the fee, the more attractive it will be to use sneaky, the more profitable it will be to use sneaky tactics to attract more senior citizens. Finally, reduce the intensity of profit seeking in order to raise the supplier alphas. Interestingly, the two companies, Orpea and Corian, said that they wanted to transform their status into benefit corporations, so that it's not only the profit that matters, but also other socially responsible dimension. Interestingly, with Michel and with Alain Fischer, we had a little paper in Nature Medicine about the potential attractiveness of benefit corporations for to develop rare diseases, develop rare disease treatments, and particular gene therapy. I think it's relevant here too. What this model shows is that if you can raise the alpha I's, well, this will increase the level of ethics in the at equilibrium. And of course, going for not-for-profits is might be an extreme way of doing it. I still think that making sure that one controls these companies, because it's not because you're not for profit that everything is solved. There are quality control issues that are there also, but I think it could help. Anyway, what I've just presented is a simple model that indicates that markets are not an intrinsic problem, but that the nature of competition is key. That with flexible prices, intense symmetric competition does not crowd out equilibrium ethical choices, which are determined by the ethical preferences of the various stakeholders, including consumers and the firm. But with asymmetric ethical preferences of suppliers, intense competition does crowd out supplier ethics, and this calls for protection of more ethical suppliers, for example, not-for-profit ones. And I hope I've convinced you that this naturally applies to the opioid crisis and retirement home scandals. Thank you.
So we have a first question from Gani. Gani, if you would like to raise the questions live.
Yeah, so thanks, Mathias. It's fascinating. It's the second time I'm seeing it, and each time I find new things interesting. Wonderful. So I had the following question, which is, in your model, my understanding is that the response of the market to the more intense competition is somewhat internal, in the sense that it has to do with this interplay between two types of consumers. But there exists also some literature to which I partly contributed with Thierry, that there exists an external response also to the more intense competition by watchdogs or by regulator, right? So you can have this other effect where, for example, more intense competition and therefore more cutting corners that start to emerge also calls for a more intense response by, say, NGOs that do the watchdog activity and therefore actually launch boycotts, so boycotts somehow endogenous through this IO of the organization side of the non-profit sector. Or it could be also a model where a regulator would step in if suppose the regulated activity is costly. In that case, that will be more intense monitoring happening from the external agents that would also compensate downwards a little bit this problem, right? So do you think this is relevant? Do you think the same thing can happen in your model, or is it orthogonal?
Well, thank you for the question. I think that that indeed, well, here we don't endogenize at all the behavior of the regulator or of watchdogs. I would, well, in the case of the relevance results, if you with fixed prices, with flexible prices and symmetric competition, more intense competition does not worsen the problem, so there is no real reason for rational regulators or NGOs to be more assertive. On the other hand, if indeed it's either fixed prices or the entry of very unethical or very aggressive suppliers, there would be, and well, I guess the French case, I don't know if you saw a cash investigation but the problem was huge and the regulators were not really looking. So I think why, I don't really know. There is a huge difference between indeed, for example, regulation, safety regulation for airplanes, where you have extremely strict regulation for safety. You do have, of course, some pretty assertive companies, I think Ryanair and so on, but they seem to not to crash planes. So I think that is, it seems to work. Here, I think it was a bit more like in some countries, banking regulation, when you haven't had a crisis for decades, and then boom, after 2008, 2009, you wake up and you do it. My point is that I think that indeed, if you have, for example, in a world of, let's say, retirement homes, by the way, universities, you have some for-profit universities that have done a pretty bad jobs in educating their students while charging a lot of money. There was an article just in the New York Times yesterday on this. The regulators haven't really woken up to that yet, controlling quality. So what exactly, you often need a crisis to change these kinds of things, to create the political momentum. But I guess in France, that moment has arrived. Now it's interesting on the opioid crisis, there were already reports in the early 2000s about the problem of Purdue Pharma, OxyContin and the like, and it took quite a lot of time for people to, for politicians to wake up. But I guess it depends on the institutional setting and the power of the various players. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, Mathias, we have a question related to rare disease and pricing of orphan drugs for rare disease. And the question is, because companies are incentivized to increase pricing and show increasingly profit-seeking behavior, but the consumers are not irresponsible consumers. Also, they would do anything to pay for a drug that potentially saved their life. So how do you translate this into recommendation regarding pricing? And I will follow up on that question.
Okay, I think it's a pretty good question. When we wrote this little paper with you, Michel, and with Alain, so we had in mind a model, a market, sorry, where because of the small number of patients, it's not as if you had the zillions of companies trying to sell. So it's not a problem that arose from excessive competition. The problem is more that indeed, once you have a kind of a monopoly on a new treatment that saves your life, but that you ask for really a lot of money, you do create a problem for the public budgets. And at the same time, indeed, these are very potentially, well, they are life-saving drugs, and therefore the moral pressure is big. I guess what we would need to do in this model, but we haven't done it, is to add a payer, the government, that has to decide on the price, and where once the drug is there, will feel a fair amount of pressure to reimburse, and it may be taken advantage of by the company. Why patients, they are not like the consumers here that pay, they can't pay, and so the question is, well, there was this one case, famous case of kind of crowdfunding, which has, by the way, led now the drug to be reimbursed by the Belgian authorities. I would think that in this model, one thing that could be investigated is how a change in the alpha I, and indeed benefit corporation would be an increase in the alpha I, how that can affect then the government reaction. Well, Gani was suggesting that the regulator and more NGOs could change their behavior. I think it would be interesting to include the government as a player in that game and see how it would adjust its behavior given a change in the profit status of the company.
I think it's also fair to say that the development of those drugs is very expensive, and that the market is small. So that's the usual answer of the companies. And again, and I think that during all your talk, there was all these questions of trade-off. And I have perhaps myself two questions. The first is, you had a slide where you put moral behavior on one hand and competition on the other hand, right? So, as you know, I don't know much in economics, but for me, more and more competition is globalized at the world level, whereas moral behavior is very different from country to countries, from even continents from continents. So how do you reconcile this? Because is it really possible to find a balance there where, again, there is this disequilibrium?
Well, I do agree that that the competition in a number of markets, including pharma, does involve a lot of global players, and that often there is a question of who, at times, countries are put in competition against one another. At times, on the other hand, the European Union is trying to coordinate things in order to have more power. I think that one thing which homogenizes things is that on the big pharma side, these companies, and I'm talking about the companies in North America and Europe, I think interestingly, their shareholders are pretty similar in their alphas. They may even be owned by similar shareholders, because you have more and more these big asset managers like BlackRock or Vanguard or Fidelity that turn out to be quite. There is a literature on that, and on pharma, I think Antonio Estache has managed to get some data. And so, in a sense, I'm not sure that they are seen as that different. Even though, by the way, there can be differences. For example, the pricing strategy for COVID vaccines, pricing strategy of AstraZeneca was different from Pfizer or Moderna, because they had decided to go not for profit during the pandemic. Of course, they were also less experienced in that. It was maybe an entry strategy, but I do think that on the supply side, I'm not sure that there is this huge difference in their alphas. Of course, I guess if you look at the Serum Institute or things like that, I mean, there may be other, and I think there could be frankly, could be an idea to introduce more of those. Of course, what the model is saying is that if the competition is very strong, then you may want to, it may not help that much to introduce some of those, especially if they still have to not lose money, unless you also start putting some pressure on the existing for-profit ones to behave a bit less aggressive. Beyond that, there is definitely heterogeneity of values. On the other side, there are and indeed, some of these cases, the consumer is the state that pays, and they may have different strategies in terms of social concerns. It's interesting that, for example, in the US, the state allows Medicare to have very, very high prices. And it's the government that has said Medicare is not allowed to negotiate. Instead, in Europe, things are better, even though at times the cost may be that the availability is low because the market is less remunerative. And then the question becomes whether that depends, of course, on the profit motive of the companies, and you may want to have discussions there. And therefore, our idea, let's at least, even though it is indeed costly and there are few patients, let's at least try and limit abuse by going for benefit corporation. So that is something a government that is also a payer could, if the political will is there and the power is there, it could indeed impose on the companies.
Yeah, the governments actually are more than payers. They are also responsible for regulation at large, for example, in the drug business. But then you alluded to these two, they are also providing subsidies.
Yep.
And well, myself, I have been involved in some discussion at the Walloon level about the subsidies to the weapon industry, which is quite strong in this region. And it's interesting because you put somewhere, selling weapons to dictators, that's unethical. But where do you put the limit? Okay, to sell weapons to to Russia, that there is no debate. But I think that it's really difficult, because to say that to produce and sell weapons which are there to kill people at the end of the day, is ethical, and we know that it's important for some economies, including the Walloon economy. Well, I think that probably it's difficult to put this into an equation.
No, you're right. Let's say, first of all, this paper is more descriptive paper than a normative paper. So we are agnostic. I think you can indeed naturally say, well, when we say ethical here, we are just saying, okay, different actors may have different ethical preferences. The best example is, of course, consumers, where we say at times they want, there are some consumers who like to cheat to win sports events, and there are some that are ready to pay more for green technologies and fair trade. We take that as a given, and we are asking ourselves, how will companies react, given that they have their own societal concern, because they are indeed run by people too. So, and we just take as a given the societal concern and everybody's societal concern, and we ask the question, which is, let's say, I wouldn't say narrow, but which is targeted, which is, how does the intensity of competition, how will it affect what happens? And as we say, well, with flexible prices, symmetric competition, it won't affect the level of ethics. On the other hand, there is a lot of competition, and you let enter people that are very greedy and ethical, they will win. Because that's the and so if you think, for example, that senior citizens in retirement homes are fragile, don't understand exactly what's going on, or not well enough, there do not count on not-for-profits to discipline the others. And by the way, in fact, even though everybody's saying that, of course, the senior citizens are mistreated because the state doesn't subsidize enough. Well, what the model says is that if you increase the subsidy, you will increase the attractiveness of unethical behavior. So that's a problem. So I guess that's the...
Okay, let me formulate my question in another way. Government provides subsidies, and subsidies, I guess, by definition, will influence the competition process, right?
Yeah.
So it's true that your paper doesn't provide recommendations, but I think that it's natural to see how we can, in a way, enhance the ethical components of the equilibrium, and this is perhaps so. Benefit cooperation might be one way, I understood.
Yeah.
But the other way might be for the government to provide advantage in terms of subsidies to companies which indeed are benefit cooperation or are supposed to be more ethical. Could you comment on that?
Oh yes, I mean, indeed, what the model shows is that when we look at a world where not-for-profits, by assumption, price to cost. And when competition is strong enough, basically, in order to survive at the price to cost, they have to be, in some cases, less and less different in their ethical behavior from the for-profit companies, and indeed there, if you start subsidizing only the not-for-profits, they will be able to maintain a higher level of ethics, even if consumers are naive. So I fully agree that finding a way to subsidize some corporate forms would be a good idea. By the way, you may get into trouble with Europe on this, because Europe would say competition, and that's a problem. And there, Europe may want to rethink. I fully agree. At least for some sectors where the problem is really important. That is, sectors where consumers are very naive, or where it is very attractive to have dirty technology and so on.
Again, from the outside, it seems to me that their economists like yourself and Jean Tirole have really something important to deliver to the European Union, and to draw their attention to the importance of perhaps revising some of the rules which might prevent useful actions, but just...
Okay, thank you. I will tell Jean, and I will think about it. Thanks a lot.
Well, and it's probably the right time to do so, by the way. I have another question here for you. What if the consumer has low or no purchasing power and competition doesn't exist? Is the EU-US market then the moral compass of the low and middle income countries? Indeed, here the benefit corporation come in, but who will take the political leadership to instance such companies? Well, it comes a bit back to the previous question.
No, yes, indeed. Thank you for the question. It is true that and it's true for the pharma market, but for other essential goods and services, of course, if you're interested in profit, you focus on the attractive parts of demand, and then you may be able to extract more money from rich countries. I mean, clearly it's important to keep in mind that that indeed these should be kind of global public goods. And I'm not sure the model, I would have to think about it. I'm not sure that this model has that much to say in the sense that we have this demand function, and the key thing we add is this idea of net price. That consumers care not only about the price, but the ethical implication. But we don't have different types of customers with different wealth and therefore different willingness to pay. Of course, in these kind of cases, what is needed is to either create more demand by having rich countries give money to poor countries in order that they can buy the product at a high price, or force companies to also sell at a lower price to poor countries, while making sure that you don't have too much arbitrage, so that everybody goes to buy at the low price and comes back to the rich market. I guess these are issues that are well studied. But I think it would be interesting also to look at cases where it is true that at times companies will sell high quality products in rich countries because there is proper quality regulation, and then sell worse quality products while telling poor countries, don't worry, it's good enough for you. And there, I think it would be interesting to, then, I think it would be interesting indeed to generalize the model to have a rich market and a poor market, and to see where and how should regulation work there.
Yeah, still, since we have still a few minutes for those who are interested, your last comment is very relevant to the current situation regarding COVID-19 vaccines. And let me very clear, if you think about the AstraZeneca and Janssen vaccines, which are based on those adenoviral vectors, those are good vaccines. They seem indeed less efficient than the mRNA vaccine, especially with the new variant. But they are efficient, and they could still play an important role in in fighting the pandemic. However, what we see right now is that indeed rich countries actually donate quite a lot of those, especially AstraZeneca vaccines, to low and middle income countries, saying exactly what you said. Those are good vaccines, and we don't use them anymore because we had very rare cases of adverse events. But we still think that those vaccines can be used. Well, especially, and then the countries react. You say, okay, you say this for us, but you don't use them anymore. So I think that this is a real problem, and the consequence is terrible, because it means that, especially in some African countries, they don't use those vaccines. They say, thank you very much, but if it's not good for you, it's not good for us. So those are indeed difficult questions.
No, I fully agree. I must admit that I found the backlash against AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson a bit excessive, maybe. But my understanding is that one advantage also of AstraZeneca or Johnson & Johnson is that it doesn't have to be kept at such low temperature, and therefore for areas where it's a bit where the infrastructure is not as good, that might be helpful. There are also these people who say that mRNA being so new, some people are worried about them. I've heard some friends telling me that their doctor was saying, go AstraZeneca because we don't know what the other is. I understand that it's excessive, but I think this could have been managed better because.
No, I can tell you that in terms of safety, the questions are very similar. Some people will argue that even the viral vector vaccines, they were not used really before. So it's a bit the same questions. And the bottom line is that indeed in those countries they cannot accept any argument supporting the fact that a better product is used in rich countries as compared to their country. Because if they say, okay, if it's easier to produce, if it's easier to store, if it's as efficient and as safe, well, that's good for you too. So these differences, and when you look at history and what happens with colonies and all these things, some countries are extremely sensitive to this.
No, I fully agree.
And this just fuel vaccine hesitancy in those countries. That's a real problem. Okay, do we have other questions, Caroline? So,
okay, well.
So thank you so much. I think that it was very, very interesting. And again, I think that you clearly underline that those questions considered by economics as extremely relevant to different sectors, including the health sector, and I'm sure that we will have further discussion in the near future. So thank you very much, and happy afternoon to everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.